Good morning and welcome to the Point. The Michigan legislature heads back to work this week in Lansing, but it's some of the work that was done in the last session that still has some Democrats more than a little angry. This morning, we talk with Kalamazoo Representative John Hoadley about some election law that he thinks is just a bad idea. Representative, let's start with the legislative session just passed. There are probably some upsides, but I know that you and a lot of the folks in your party have a big downside, and those are the election reform, that's what some people call them, pieces of legislation. Democrats don't like those at all, and you don't either. Tell me what was the matter with that process.
So the election rigging bills that were passed on a partisan basis only Republicans voted for these two terrible pieces of legislation. The reason that there was a bipartisan opposition to both bills is because they are going to make election lines longer. They're going to silence public debate. And, in the 11th hour, they passed these bills, in particular, Senate Bill 571, which they swapped out over 40 pages of new language in there with giving people less than 10 minutes to read it. So when you start getting anonymous robocalls, that's going to be thanks to your Republican colleagues.
Let's talk about those two pieces of legislation. First, the straight ticket voting. For years and years and years in Michigan, you've been able to go in and choose at the top of the ticket. You could vote for all Republicans, all Democrats. That, under this bill, and as we should point out that as you and I speak, the governor hasn't done anything, hasn't taken any action on those. By the time this airs, he probably will have. But that would go away under that bill. Tell me why, from your perspective, that's a bad thing if, as the supporters say, it's an opportunity for people to see, look, and think about each decision that they make.
If you're listening to this right now, I would be insulted that your Republicans think that you don't see, look, and think about each candidate that appears on the ballot, because that's what they've just said. But more importantly, when every county clerk association, when every one of the major associations that deals with elections comes into our elections committee and says, this piece of legislation by itself is bad because it will make lines longer, while Michigan has failed to do any reforms that many other states are doing to decrease lines and increase the accuracy, security, and convenience of voting, then we know we've got a mistake in front of us right now. Straight ticket voting is an option for people to expedite the process that it takes to go vote, and ultimately lets you present your values in another way in the ballot. So you could eliminate it, and that would be fine. But you can't purposely lengthen lines like this bill would do, while at the same time not passing any other common sense reform, like online voter registration or no reason absentee ballots, so you could actually then lessen the amount of time you have to wait in line as well.
So let me ask the most cynical part of the question. Is it your assumption that, or is it the overall assumption of people observing this, that more Democrats than Republicans vote straight ticket, and that was the reason that Republicans wanted this?
So the data actually doesn't bear that out. There's probably at a gross level more Democrats than Republicans that vote straight ticket, but it varies widely. And in fact, many counties, there's a majority of Republicans who use the straight ticket option. At the end of the day, I think it's the hypocrisy of this, the vote rigging that's happening, where people are saying we're going to choose not to listen to experts or people who actually run elections. And instead, we're going to rig the system because it's an admission that the Republican ideas aren't living up to probably what the vast majority of voters actually want. So what they want to do with these bills is to make it a hassle to go vote. So that mom that's working, who only has their lunch hour for her to go vote, she has to, if the line is longer, she's not going to be able to go vote, and she might give up. Or if she's worried about kids after work, she can't get access to the ballot, she's going to go and not be able to vote. And that's undemocratic, that's un-American, and we should not be having that in Michigan.
Let's talk about some other things, because we had the chairman of the Michigan Democratic Party on recently, and he echoed the very same things you talked about, and talked about the ability or probability that such elimination of straight ticket voting could increase the average time in the polls by a minute plus. And if you multiply that by a few hundred or 1,000 people during the course of a day, you can see where that could stretch out the lines. We'll wait and see how that plays out in terms of what the governor has probably done by the time this airs, and how it looks in practical matter, and we'll look for the legal challenges, which are sure to come to
and
that
I do
as well.
hope the governor chooses not to sign either of these pieces of legislation.
We'll, as I say, by the time this airs, we'll probably know. Let's move on to point number two. It's been just over a year since you were sworn in, took office. You came in an election that was a big Republican election in a lot of ways because they expanded their majorities over in the Senate, retook the governor's office, or remained in the governor's office. What's it been like for you in the first 12 months?
It's been a good learning experience. One of the things I've loved in my first year is that you just get to meet so many people. You get to dive in and really become experts on as much as you can in a year on various pieces of the budget or the policymaking process. But at the same time, it's really frustrating. I mean, a lot of people have watched Schoolhouse Rock and think that's how it works in Lansing, and it's not. At the end of the day, who is in the majority really has a lot of say in deciding not only what bills come up for a vote, but even if a bill will be heard in committee. I have the most amount of election-related legislation in my committee. I've introduced the most number of bills. In fact, I think I have one of the bills with the greatest number of co-sponsors in the entire legislature. But that bill won't even be heard in the committee yet. And it really speaks to how partisan this process is. And that's unfortunate. But I think it would do voters a service to know that party really does matter in Lansing. Who has the gavel matters a lot.
Well, it matters a great deal, and it over the course of the past 20 years that I've been observing it, it swings in a very broad pendulum swing with the same complaints from both parties when they are in the minority. What is that bill that you just spoke of that has the most co-sponsors?
And again, we have to double check,
right.
But I think it's my concealed pistol license as a form of voter identification. So when you go to the polls, I actually proposed a common sense solution that you could use that as a form of ID when you go vote at the polls. 74 co-sponsors and myself as the prime sponsor, and that hasn't even been heard in my committee yet.
Why do you think that something like that, and I don't know what all the ins and outs are, I haven't read the bill to be clear, but if it is just as you described, what would be the problem with that?
The problem is partisanship. I'm someone that has been a vocal critic of some of the corporate welfare, like the switch deal that happened. I came out strong against the third grade reading bill that's going to force children to be held behind despite the objections of parents, teachers, and educators. And so those are things that are then told to me that, well, we can't hear your bill in committee yet. And it's a real shame because this should be about ideas and about policy making that's in the best interest of what the majority of Michiganders need and want. And this is a small, non-controversial piece of legislation that might actually help lessen the line just a little bit at some of these polling places. So why can't we have some action on that?
You understand politics. You know these things don't happen in a vacuum, though, right?
Things don't. They don't happen in a vacuum, but they should be about the policies and what's going to help people. Which also goes to show that when those same people are criticizing the process as is and says you should force every voter to look at every single name, let's also not forget that the party is still going to be by each one of those names. And they do that because Lansing still works on organizing the agenda, the committees, and the whole process based on which party's in power. I would love to see us move away from that. Let's start doing nonpartisan redistricting. Let's reform term limits so we can have some stability and some experts, not just lobbyists making the rules. And let's try to reduce the amount of money in politics. If we were to work on these three things, we could actually get our government that's responsive for the people.
One of the things you just mentioned intrigues me. We've talked about the nonpartisan redistricting, and I'm very interested in that as both an observer and as a citizen and voter. But let's put that aside for a moment. You talked about revising or revisiting term limits. I have not spoken, and I'm not suggesting that they don't exist, but I haven't spoken to one legislator who has served since term limits who hasn't suggested the same thing. Yet, those people numbering well into the hundreds, maybe 500 or 600, I don't know how many people have come through that process over the past decade and a half. Yet there has been no serious effort to do that. Why is that?
That's because there are political donors that would rather see revolving door legislators than thoughtful leadership where people can say no to their party, or that they could actually take big votes that are going to help the entire state. The problem with term limits is that they keep focusing us on 2-year cycles, not 20-year cycles, and thinking about what's the best in our long-term health. And then there's a powerful special interests that are out there that say, if you talk about trying to make government actually work, then we're going to try to get you out of government. And I think we're seeing this play out, though, every 20 years where people say there's something about the rules that we're using right now that aren't working well. And we saw that whether it was with term limits and some of the government budget constraints 20 years ago, it was before that it was Watergate. But now I think it's people saying the rules seem to be rigged and we need to do something to make government of the people and by the people, not for the special interests like we're seeing right now. Term limits would help.
Quickly, we are out of time. You mean revisiting term limits?
Absolutely.
We're out of time. What's your top priority to get done in 2016?
The biggest is I think we need to look at the funding for education. That's going to be my top priority with big budget cuts happening, and we've given away a ton of our government money right now. We're going to have some budgets that are stretched very thin, and we got to make sure we're protecting schools and our kids.
When we come back, one of the biggest issues the legislature will have to deal with this session, and it has so many different points of view. That's next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. If you've been following along with the show, you know over the past several months we have done a number of programs that have dealt with energy policy in the state of Michigan. That energy policy that they were working on last year is carrying over to this year because so far there is no agreement. Both the House and the Senate are looking at ideas of how we produce, use, and regulate energy. This morning we bring you yet another point of view, this from a group who says that more choice is a good thing. We were just talking before we started. This is the 8th or 9th show that I have devoted either entirely or in this case partially towards energy regulation and what's going to happen in Michigan as we move towards that. Now, all last year I was doing shows ever so often thinking that this was going to happen and going to happen. As it turns out, here we are in 2016 and there is no policy. That may be a good thing for people who say you should take a long, hard look at this. So tell me from your perspective, first of all, how important is this type of legislation for the future of Michigan? Because this could have a long-lasting impact.
Well, it's critically important for where Michigan is today and where Michigan would like to be in the future. The governor has termed Michigan as the comeback state, as he likes to tell people, and I think that's true. I mean, we've done a lot of good things. They've made some pretty significant policy decisions that I think have impacted business. But one of the things that they've sort of left behind is this whole discussion on energy policy. And if you look at where Michigan is at today compared to the neighboring states that we primarily do business with, especially in the Midwest, we are lagging far behind. Our energy prices are in some cases 20 and 30% higher than what our neighbors in, say, Illinois or Indiana or Ohio pay for their energy. And so as manufacturing makes a comeback here in the state of Michigan, you recognize that many of the big employers are on choice, but there are others who would like to be on choice who can't, simply because we've maxed out at the 10% cap. And so the argument we're making is it's time for us to go back to the policy we had in the late 90s and early 2000, where we're actually opening up the market to full choice. The interesting thing for me, having been involved in this debate now, this is the third go-around. I was actually a legislator during the first two. The arguments that the utilities are using today are the same arguments they used in 1998. They opposed choice. They gave all kinds of reasons for why choice was a bad thing. Then the legislature gave them $2.2 billion in subsidies, and suddenly they said, we fully embrace choice. If you look at their arguments, they don't stand up. They don't pass the smell test, and they don't pass the common sense test.
Well, let's talk about that, because you say it's interesting because they were making the same arguments 20 years ago. I find it interesting because a few weeks ago, I was sitting here with one of your former colleagues who, and as I said, Republicans, as you served as a Republican House and Senate member, as did Ken Sikma, and I said Republicans are usually free market, let the market decide kind of guys, and he said yes until it comes to this. And so he is supporting the side that says he would like to see a fully regulated market, and you're talking about a choice market. So here are two folks who came from more or less similar backgrounds, I won't say the same backgrounds, at least served in the same party in the same legislative body at the same time, roughly. But you come to different conclusions. So let me start with part of their argument. You say their arguments don't pass the smell test. Here's part of the argument. That in order for the regulated utilities, the current big two, essentially, to be required to provide enough baseload to cover the entire state of Michigan, they have to be guaranteed a certain percentage of the market. Because if they're not, then they could be overproducing and costing money or passing that cost along to consumers. That isn't...
Well, that argument they use, I think, demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how the energy market works today. What they don't let people know is that they're buying off the market today to service their existing customers, and they only have 90% of the load in Michigan, right? So what they produce as a utility, they put on the grid, and then they buy off the grid to service their customers. AESs also buy off the grid to service their customers. Now, some of the energy they buy could be energy produced by DTE or consumers, but not necessarily, right? So they buy it across the region and move it to where it's needed. So when the utilities say we need to have a guaranteed rate of return, what they're not telling people is they're going to produce as much energy as they can produce anyway, because they put it on the grid and it gets bought by people, right? So Ken didn't remind you, I'm sure, that when he was in the Senate, he actually was responsible for the choice bill moving out of committee because the chair at the time opposed it. And so when the chair got called out of the committee room, Senator Sikkema at the time was the vice chair. He took the gavel, moved the bill to the floor, and the rest is history. But had he not done that, that bill would still be stuck in committee. We never would have experienced choice in Michigan, and we wouldn't know the benefits of choice.
Quickly, for me and those listening, an AES is a...
Alternative energy supplier, sorry.
So, no, that's fine. Because this is a complex issue, and for folks like you and Senator Sikkema and the others that are involved, the current serving members, they're dealing with this all of the time. For those of us who just want the lights to come on when we flip the switch, I'm not sure how many I know do care. But for example, we've talked to the folks who want alternative energy sources, and we've talked to the people full regulation. You talk about choice. My consideration is when the light switch goes on, the lights come on and it's reliable. There are concerns expressed by folks on the other side that if you go to this alternative choice, and I don't mean alternative energy, but this choice of getting energy from other sources, that it might not be there. Is there a way to guarantee that if you contract with a company that is offering this service, that it will be there? And if it's not, there's some repercussion for that company?
Again, you've seen the commercials on TV that the utilities are running, scaring people into believing that in a choice market, reliability is an issue. Reliability is not an issue, and it hasn't been, and it won't be. Any number of states, Illinois, Ohio, that are choice states, Pennsylvania, they don't have reliability issues. In fact, the Public Service Commission itself said reliability is not necessarily going to be a problem. And through the MISO region, which is the grid system that Michigan operates under, they've also said, at least in the foreseeable future, there's enough supply to meet the demand.
Is there, and I don't know if you can answer this because you can't get into the private contracts of private companies, but is there a way to gauge the relative cost savings or increase if you have broader choice? In other words, one would suspect that there must be cost savings for people to go to choice, otherwise there wouldn't be a particular reason to do it. But do you have any broad numbers that suggest what that kind of savings might be?
Between 20 and 30%. I mean, it's a big number, right? Choice works. Choice lowers costs for the people that need the energy, that buy the energy. It improves customer service. Let me bring you back again to 1998-99. When we opened up the Michigan market to full choice, we never reached a time when we had over 18% of the load taking advantage of choice, because the utilities got smarter, they dropped their prices, they improved their service, and people stayed. And in fact, when we changed the law in 2008, we were at 3% choice. A lot of people came back to the utilities because they got better at competition. When we passed the act, I remember this testimony. I was on the committee in the Senate. They said, we think 10% is a very generous number. We don't see any scenario where in the next 20 years we hit 10%. 12 months later, we were at 10% in the DTE, Detroit Energy Service Territory, and in the consumers territory. Now, if we were to eliminate that 10% number, that reference in the law, and just be silent on it, we would be at over 25% choice right now, just based on who's taking advantage of choice and those customers that are in the queue waiting to jump into choice. That's as high a demand for choice as we've ever had in Michigan.
And we should point out that most of these, not all, but most of these are bigger groups, big companies, corporations, that kind of thing, that obviously can make that savings.
Well, they have energy
substantial.
managers
Yeah.
that are looking for deals, right? They're very smart because it's a cost to do business for them. But what we've seen in other states like Illinois, the fastest growing market segment in choice has been residential, because communities were given the opportunity to aggregate their load. So a city like Grand Rapids could go to an AES, an alternative energy supplier, and say, here's how much load the residents of our city proper use in energy. Quote us a price. And so then rather than having the invoice come from consumers, they would pay their invoice through City Hall, and City Hall would make the purchase from an alternative energy supplier. That's what Chicago did at one point. I think they've since switched to something else. But the fastest growing segment in Illinois was the residential market.
You've seen this bill as it has started to move through the legislature, and as I said, it's moved slower than some might have expected. I think the roads deal may have gotten in the way, but there's also this big disagreement among folks about alternative energy use, about the choice issue. But you're also a former legislator, and you know how this kind of grinds slowly. As I look at it as an observer right now, I don't see any of the chairmen that are necessarily pushing the cause of more choice. How do you get there? We've got about 60 seconds left.
Well, I don't think you get there with this bill. I mean, the support for the bill that's in the House that moved to the floor has peaked at about 23 votes. That's in both caucuses. And so the chairman had to negotiate with the Democrats on renewable energy in order to get the bill out of committee. Otherwise, it would still be stuck there. And a majority of the Republican caucus in the House said, no way, we don't support this, for any number of reasons, choice being one. So I think, as I've been quoted saying in Lansing, we're at a stalemate. And the only way you're going to move past this, I think, is if the governor brings in both sides and says, let's work out a solution that's good for both parties. We understand the utility concerns, although I wouldn't be quite as generous to the utilities because I think in many respects they're flat out lying. But I also understand the concerns of the choice people who say this is an important issue especially to the manufacturers who are high users of energy. We need to provide them some relief because they're competing against companies in other states that are paying significantly less for their energy than what we're paying here in Michigan.
Look for energy policy to be one of the big issues the legislature tries to tackle this year. And also go to woodtv.com and look for all of the shows we've done about the subject over the past several months. We're back with more To the Point in just a moment. That'll do it for this week. We've got a lot going on this year. Decision 2016 means a big presidential race and much more. I hope you'll join us every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock for To the Point.